Well, first I was gonna say what's I think is very interesting is not everybody does know who Dr. Crippen was. And, in a straw poll of hands in any given room, and I'll ask, how many people know about the murder case, about the case of Dr. Crippen? And about, it's kind of half and half. There'll be half the people will have heard the name and know about it, and everybody else will, have no idea. So it is really new stuff to a lot of people. And also it's a reassessment. So what I have done differently in Story of a Murder is to center, well, it's an ensemble cast. This is not just Dr. Crippen's story. This is the story of, well, the full title of the book is Story of a Murder, The Wives, the Mistress, and Dr. Crippen. This is the story of the first wife he was married to. No, not a lot of people who actually even familiar with the story know about Charlotte Belle. Is also the story of Belle Elmore, his second wife, who he was noted for killing. And the story of Ethel Le Neve, who was his mistress and also his accomplice in this murder. And but it's also the story of the Music Hall Ladies Guild, which was the group. Sorry. This is also the story of the Music Hall Ladies Guild, which was the kind of proto-union charity group that Belle Elmore was part of in London, who really were behind getting Scotland Yard interested in solving this murder. Everybody has a role to play in this story. As I said, it is an ensemble cast. It is a kind of telling from a number of different perspectives, which is why it's called Story of a Murder, because I wanted to make sure I was not telling the story of a murderer. This is not from Crippen's perspective. And it's not even it's not even solely from the perspective of the detective, Inspector Dew, who captured him and wrote a memoir about that, which he called I Caught Crippen. It is a story told by everyone. And I like to say, actually, that traditionally this story has been a story which is told by men. It was written and documented by men, but has been appropriated from women. There are so many women in this turn of the century story, and it gives us such an insight into what life was like, not only for women but men, what the world was like, both in America and both in the UK at this time. And so it is a very broad and very panoramic telling. Because it's an ensemble story, the stories are very much interwoven. Um, so Dr. Crippen's first wife was a woman named Charlotte Bell. And Charlotte was from Ireland originally. Her family were Protestants in Southern Ireland from County Laois. And they were, uh, well, they were, I want to say, they were the land agents class. So they were the kind of rent collectors. They weren't This class of people weren't necessarily very well liked, but they didn't really have their own land like anybody else, the majority of other people in Ireland at that time. So when the famine came, they were affected just as much as everybody else because they paid rent to Lord de Vesci, and they didn't own their property. And so the Bells had to leave. Charlotte and her brothers and her mother and her sister all immigrated, and they ended up in America, in New York, in the 1880s. Prior to that, Charlotte had lived in the UK and had trained as a teacher. What is so remarkable about this woman was that she actually, in the 1880s, had two careers at a time when women didn't have a career. She trained for two careers before the age of 30. So she trained as a teacher, and then when she came to New York, she retrained as a nurse. And it was in training as a nurse, a homeopathic nurse, that she met Holly Harvey Crippen, who was an American who had been born in Coldwater, Michigan. And They together then decided to start their lives over in San Diego, California, and spent time moving around the country as he was looking for a better position, which he had very itchy feet. He was very restless, and he was given a very good position in New York at the ophthalmic hospital and left it mysteriously after 3 months. And then the family ends up in Salt Lake City. And shortly after they arrive in Salt Lake City, Charlotte dies mysteriously. And on the death certificate, it says she dies basically of a stroke. But strangely, he says in an obituary, which is in a trade magazine, that she died of a heart attack. And she's put in a pauper's grave, unmarked grave. She's buried within 72 hours in the dead of winter when the ground is still frozen. And he never talks about her again. So that is Charlotte. Within a couple of months, so he moves to New York, back to Brooklyn, and he meets Cora, or she would call herself Belle Elmore. She had a number of different names, and she was born in Williamsburg, in a tenement, to a German mother and a father who was Russian Polish, and they were very poor. And her father died when she was very young, and her mother remarried a German man called Frederick Messinger, who raised her. And she had a fairly good education for that time. She spoke fluent French. I was fluent German. She learned French. And then when she was about 16 or 17, she went out to become a maid for a wealthy man called Charles Lincoln, who had recently put his wife in an insane asylum. And shortly after that, she finds herself pregnant. We don't know what the circumstances were. But the man who was involved in the abortion she had, whether the aftercare or involved in the actual performing of it, was Crippen. And Crippen had trained as an obstetrics and gynecological specialist, which makes him even creepier. And bizarrely, they form a relationship out of this abortion, and she marries him. And Crippen decides he wants no more children, and so he has her sterilized. And so she decides she's gonna become an opera singer, which was, I think, incredibly resilient of her. And when he's transferred to London by his mentor, who is James Monroe Munyon, who is this very famous patent medicine salesman. And, Crippen is at this time really dabbling in very shady medicine. And he goes into medical fraud and actual stock fraud as well. He's a fraudster, he's a con artist. And he's transferred to London, and she decides to become a music hall singer, a music hall performer instead of an opera singer. And that's where she really kind of finds her feet amongst the Musical Ladies Guild. And she finds a community of women who, she really gels with, and she becomes involved in the charitable endeavors and the charitable work of the organization until she is murdered. Now, one of the people who is involved along with Crippen in this murder, or I should say the only other person, is his typist, as they were called at the time, Ethel Le Neve, or Ethel Neve, as she was born. And Ethel comes from a background not entirely dissimilar from that of Belle, in that she's born into poverty. She's from East Anglia, from a little town, and she's born into a two-room cottage. And her father, who had an education, he was the first in his family to become a clerk, wanted an education really progressively for his daughters as well, wanted them to work in the clerical world, which was an opportunity for girls in the 1890s, which wasn't available before then. It was a respectable job, being a shorthand typist, being a bookkeeper. And so Ethel and her sister were given training in this in London. He moved the family to London, and she started working for Crippen. And Ethel was very ambitious. Um, there was a very dark streak to her personality. She was thought to be very demure and very understated, and it was an act. Ethel had a lot of agency, which people didn't give her credit for, and Ethel knew what she wanted. And Ethel was enormously jealous of Belle's life. Belle hung out with celebrities. I mean, imagine these musical performers were like TV stars today. And Ethel was always watching in the wings. She wanted the life, and she wanted the clothes, and she wanted the jewelry, and she wanted the big house that they lived in with 10 rooms. And she was willing to, well, get involved in a plot to get rid of Belle Elmore. Um, and did so and never expressed a single word of remorse for the rest of her life.